outplacement support, it wasn't a term that I'd heard of. So I've spent 25 years working in HR, and I probably hadn't heard of it for about sort of half of my HR career. It's really that thing that lets people know that at a difficult time, employers still do care about what happens to them. It is one of those times when leadership, you really need to step up and step into that role of leader. Well, what does this individual need from me at this moment? Yes, I've got the words I need to deliver, I get that, but then what do they need? I'm sure everything will be okay. It could be the best thing that ever happened to you. None of those things aren't well-meaning. It's not like that individual doesn't want to help, but at that point in time, none of those things are really helpful. It's hard to be empathetic because it takes a piece of you to connect with something in that individual. If you're managing people, then the chances are that you're going to need that relationship with the HR business partner, and so I would encourage you to do that. You'll have more of that guidance, you'll have more of that information, you'll just feel like you're not doing this alone, if you like, as a line manager.
Hey, welcome to the Leaders Podcast with me, Laura McDonald, the leadership coach and mentor. Come with me as I explore the elements of leadership that give leaders like you the power and confidence to make the impact you know you can. I'll be sharing my own experiences, top tips and insights, and talking to some very special guests to share their thoughts and leadership experiences on mindset, influence, change and growth. So let's get right to it. Today's guest supports one of the hardest elements of any leader's job. I'm so pleased to welcome June Hogan, outplacement support specialist and career coach, helping HR professionals manage redundancies with clarity and compassion. Welcome to the Leaders Podcast, June.
Oh, thank you, Laura. I'm really excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited to and interested to get into this conversation with you. But before I do, I ask all of my guests a question. So we as leaders are there to serve our teams and others, but serving ourselves enables us to serve everyone else so much better. So I'm on a mission at the moment to share all the ways my lovely guests do this. So my question for you is, what have you done to serve yourself in the last 24 hours?
Well, almost like I planned it. I did some exercise this morning. So I try and do some exercise of some description every day. And I find that really, although it takes up time and there's a gazillion other things that I could be doing in that time. I find that if I do something, it could just be a short walk. It could be, I've got a spin bike. It could be weights. It could be just kind of, doing some stretches, but whatever it is, I try and do some sort of exercise every day.
What kind of exercise is like your favorite thing to do? What do you like to do most?
My favorite thing to do? Well, I'd quite like to sit and eat chocolate, but that's not that exercise. Doesn't really exercise.
That's an exercise. One.
Yeah, exercise my hands. No, my favorite type of exercise is probably well, I've recently started doing a weights class, and not so I can become a power lifter, but just because it helps with, mobility and longevity and all those other things that we can read about. And I enjoy it because it's part of a group and because the instructor has a lovely way of coaching us, and because you can kind of feel successful in your own way. So I enjoy doing that. And I also do yoga, and that has a similar feel, that there's no competition there. It's just about showing up, being you, doing your thing, and just devoting some time to yourself. So those are probably my two favorite ones. My spin bike, I have a love-hate relationship with my spin bike, but that's a different type of exercise.
I had a conversation with someone the other day about rowing machines, and I said if I ever used a rowing machine, I probably feel like it would be that same kind of relationship, like a love-hate relationship.
Yeah,
it's always fascinated me, the idea of doing it, but actually doing it's probably going to be like, I hate this so much.
Yeah, no, I've been on a rowing machine before, and I much prefer a spin bike. And to be fair, when I get on the spin bike, I enjoy it, but I do procrastinate quite a lot before I get on it. But when I finished any form of exercise, the effort and the kind of commitment to do it is definitely worth it. And I think that's the motivation. You talk about investing in yourself. It's knowing what the output is, what the feeling's like after you've done something, and what the input that you're going to create time for is actually what's the point of it. Because you said before about we're leaders, we lead ourselves. We can't really lead others if we're in bad shape, and that could be mentally, that could be physically. It can be, you can feel disorganized. It can be lots of different reasons why you might not feel in the best shape. So that's what I'm trying to do for myself anyway.
Yeah, definitely. Sounds really empowering. I mean, I've always found exercise generally always makes me feel good, but mine was definitely, especially when I was younger, was always like team sports. I used to love things like that. So I played a lot of like rugby and football,
Hmm.
but it was two very different cultures. Like football was very extremely competitive, and there was still like that team element of it, but it wasn't quite the same as playing rugby. Rugby just had this, yeah, family feel to
Mm.
it. It was a very
Yeah,
different
yeah.
environment. But it's yeah, I was always that. And then I took up like yeah, more solo exercise during COVID and started like running and lifting weights and stuff at home. And yeah, I was kind of like, yeah, I can get into this. But then there was no one to hold me accountable, which is probably why I went for team sports all those years. So
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. No,
yeah.
accountability is a big part of anything really. I think if you're gonna maybe try and eat differently or more healthily or commit to doing anything, I think accountability for certain personality types is really important to help you keep going.
So June, as I said, you're an outplacement support specialist and a career coach. So lots of people are probably familiar with that second term, career coach. But can you just explain a bit more about what outplacement support is and how you got to running this incredible business of yours?
Yes, no, you're right. Outplacement support. It wasn't a term that I'd heard of. So I've spent 25 years working in HR, and I probably hadn't heard of it for about sort of half of my HR career because at that time redundancies weren't particularly common. The organisation that I worked for didn't kind of make redundancies, and so I don't think I learned about it on my CIPD, which I did many years ago. So outplacement support is essentially a group of services that values-led employers offer to people who they are having to make difficult decisions around redundancies. So there's no legal requirement to provide it, and as long as you follow a legally compliant redundancy process, that's kind of box ticked if you like. But those employers that want to do the right thing, who want to support people, who recognise the impact of redundancy and what it can have from people's kind of from a physical perspective in terms of losing a job, but also from a mental health perspective. So it's a group of services that range from practical things like helping you to write a CV, helping you to kind of show up on LinkedIn, career coaching around, okay, so what do you want to do? Thoughts around the kind of roles that you might be suited to, doing something the same, doing something different, exploring your values, digging into all of that. And also then practical things like, how do you look for a job? Lots of people that we work with haven't had to look for a job. Some have never had to look for a job. They've been in the same job their whole career. Others haven't had to look for a job for a while. And of course, things change all the time. So yeah, it's that. And it can be run on a group or an individual basis. And it's really that thing that lets people know that at a difficult time, employers still do care about what happens to them. That's how I would kind of frame it, really.
Yeah, definitely. How did you get to this place where you were running an outplacement support business?
Yeah, well, I never thought that I would run a business. I didn't have it on my bucket list or anything like that. I was quite happy being employed. And so I worked in HR for around 25 years. And during that time, I was made redundant twice. The first time was when the company went into administration. So I lost my job overnight along with thousands of other people. And I'd been working for 8 years at that point. So really early into my career. And this kind of wasn't supposed to happen. It's like, oh, I now know, literally, I found out on the 10 o'clock news, or maybe it was 9 o'clock news, it's that long ago, that the company gone into administration. And I thought, oh, that doesn't sound good, does it? And I can vividly remember exactly where I was when I found out. And up until that point, my career had been going really well. I was I was the youngest senior manager in the whole of the business. I progressed really quickly from graduate through to senior HR manager. So, this wasn't supposed to happen to me. But, I dusted myself down, picked myself up, and found another role. Went to work, continued to work in HR, and then I worked with another company as a HR business partner again for 8 years. I'm not sure what it is about 8 years, but was working there and was made redundant for the second time whilst on maternity leave. So I took a bit of time out. I did some consultancy work for that organisation a few years later, and then there was a chance for us to go and live overseas. So I went to live in North America for 3 years with my family, and I couldn't work during that time. So I had to give up my job that I had as a consultant. And that's when I started to think about, well, maybe I could become a coach. Because I didn't work, and I'd always worked apart from taking maternity leave, I realised that I just couldn't not work for 3 years. I needed a sense of purpose. So I invested in coach training, which wasn't financially a great decision because coach training is expensive. And when you're not working, that's a big commitment. But I was convinced that I was going to do something with this qualification. And so when we returned to the UK in 2018, I decided to give self-employment a go because I had nothing to lose. I had no job to come back to. And then it was in 2019 that I finally decided I wanted to specialise in outplacement support because the work that I've been doing and reflecting on my personal experience of redundancy, my professional experience of redundancy, and the sorts of clients that I was working with as a coach, I decided to specialise in that area because it's an area that I really felt I could make a difference in. And I've been doing that since then. So yeah, I never thought I'd be here, and I think it's my circumstances that have led me to this point. And I really feel like I've found my place, and I feel like the work that my team and I do, it's not just me, really adds value to people, and it feels really fulfilling and worthwhile. So yeah, that's how I got to where I am.
Yeah, and you do work with some quite incredible people. I know, having been fortunate enough to work with you once. So,
Ah.
you do work with some amazing people. They're all lovely. So, yeah, I mean, as you said, you've been on your own journey with redundancy. I have too, you know that. Obviously, I was fortunate enough to get through 16 years, so 2 8, of a career before it actually happened to me. What was your kind of, biggest takeaway or your aha moment out of that process? Like, what came up for you about redundancy when it happens to you?
It's really interesting because I've been on the other side of well, I have been on both sides of the table and experiencing redundancy. And I don't believe that you have to walk in someone else's shoes in order to be able to empathize with them. And as a leader, it's pretty much impossible to have walked in someone else's shoes for everything. But certainly having been on the other side, I realized a few things. One is that when someone says your role is at risk of redundancy, after that, you don't hear anything else. So in that meeting, so when I would then be working with line managers and some of the work that I do now, helping HR professionals, prepare for redundancy consultations, is just to remember that after those words are said, the emotion will kick in, people will go into shock, they will either experience anger, they might experience sadness. The emotional side of things is really, it's a highly emotive meeting. So whatever you're doing in that situation is to remember that not much else will be heard. And most people just want to get out of the room after they've heard those words because they just want to kind of take it all in and sort of process it. So that was one of the kind of things around the reaction to redundancy. It was really, really helpful for me just to hear that insight. And also to realize that previously I'd sort of treated it more as a process. So I'd made sure that we got the rooms booked, we got the timetable ready, we got the script, we got everything ready. Everyone understood who they were going to be talking to. They felt confident with the information. That was all there. But I really overlooked the fact that managers are leading what is probably one of the hardest meetings that they will ever have to lead because these people that they're having to let go, they're good people. They haven't done anything wrong. And of course, dealing with emotion isn't always something that line managers can feel comfortable with. I am generalizing, but there's a connection they have with these people. They've worked for them for however long, and of course, it's going to be difficult. So I think I overlooked that previously in my early career. So those are a couple of insights that have made the way that I approach redundancies when I was working in HR and the way that I help others to prepare. And of course, I see the output of all of that when individuals come to work with us because they've been through that process. And I'll often get feedback as well. So it kind of helps me to see it from a kind of 360-degree perspective.
And it is very difficult, isn't it, sometimes for the people being made redundant to see all of that. The biggest takeaway I had, I'm not saying this is everybody's experience, but my experience was certainly once they've said that your role is potentially at risk, you're already gone. But in the same breath, I think I wouldn't have necessarily discovered that had I not gone on the denial crusade. And I just went into battle mode. And people don't see what's on the other side of the table. The people that are having to have those hard conversations, they don't want to have them a lot of the
Mm.
time. But it's important to note that. And I think I did reflect on that because actually the two managers that did my final consultation meeting were former managers of mine, and they knew me. They knew what I was going through. They knew like stuff about my family. They knew, all this other stuff, what was going on for me at the time. And then had to walk out of that meeting to what I believe was their own potential redundancy meetings. And I just sort of went, actually, yeah, let's have some empathy for that because the business made the decision, not these two people. That was a big aha moment for me, was like, yeah, okay, it's fine to just take your time and process and go on a crusade if you need to, but just remember that the managers sat on the other side of the table, especially in big companies, are probably not the ones that made the choice.
Yeah, that's a really interesting insight in that yeah, the managers are delivering the message. It's always harder to hear the words than it is to deliver them, of course, because you're the one, potentially left without a role. But in your situation that you mentioned there, you've got managers who are then at risk, and that's really tricky. I mean, I've worked in that sort of situation before, and both my managers who manage my redundancies, I'm friends with both of them, and I know that it was hard. Well, the first one was administration, so it's a bit different, but the second one, it was really hard for them to have that meeting, and I recognize that. In the moment it was hard for me as well, but I do think that there is a level of empathy, and I hear that sometimes from people who say, I know my manager found it really difficult, they did their best. And when you're in that situation, it is one of those times when leadership, you really need to step up and step into that role of leader, not in a distant way, not in a kind of I'm the leader and you're the team member, but it is an example of how as an organization as well, I think, leads, particularly in difficult times. And this notion of, well, what does this individual need from me at this moment? How can I support them? How can I help them? Yes, I've got the words I need to deliver. I get that. But then what do they need? What can I do? And often it won't be in that meeting, like you said, because you'll be in the emotion, it'll be too difficult. It might be just to say, recognize there's a lot for you to take in here. Here's my direct number. We can grab a coffee anytime you want, or if you're working in remote teams, look, I'll put a meeting in the diary. I'll check in on you on Tuesday, whatever. But it's recognizing that this isn't the only time that someone can have that conversation, because I think that's difficult as well. Feeling like this is, well, I've got this meeting, I've got one in a week, so and that's it. I can't talk to anyone in between, and that's when it can make redundancy really, really hard, because you need support, you need connection, you need to ask questions, you need to help yourself, as you say, wherever you are on that change curve, you want someone to hear you and listen to you and just be there for you.
Especially if you get stuck at the stage I did, which was right at the beginning of the change curve. You
Yeah.
know, when it does finally come and you get over that first sort of hill, as it were, all of these things suddenly come flooding through. And it's really overwhelming, I think, for both sides of the desk to
Mhm.
take in that, because I mean, at the end of the day, especially if you've got a good working relationship with the manager that's letting you go, you're losing that relationship as well. And that can be scary because you're like, especially if you're really appreciative of your manager, you're kind of like, oh, am I going to find anybody else like them? Am I going to be able to work in this kind of lovely environment? Am I going to have this kind of team? Am I going to have all of this again? And the manager must be thinking that too. What team am I going to be landed with? Like, if I get the joy of staying, I'm fortunate to have never had to have that conversation with a member of my teams. But yeah, I can imagine that it just must be awful. When the leadership team is first made aware that redundancies are happening, what can they do to kind of prepare themselves for those conversations?
Yeah. And that notion of kind of first being made aware, it can vary in terms of, depending on how the organization's structured. So, the most senior leaders might be the ones that are obviously involved at the beginning, and then it might come down to the operational managers who actually physically have to have the conversation. So it might be that they're made aware weeks in advance, or it could be that it's relatively short because of the way they're managing, and obviously confidentiality and all the other stuff that goes with a project plan. So I think in terms of whenever you're made aware as a leader that you have to have these conversations, what a few of the things that I would recommend is making sure that you understand the rationale behind it. You might not agree with it, but for that moment when you are delivering that message, your team members need to know that you are committed to it. Because if you start to say, well, if it was my decision, I wouldn't be doing this, or don't particularly agree with this anyway, it's not going to change anything. In fact, it just makes things worse and sort of muddies the water in a sense. So understand the rationale, ask the questions that you need to ask so that you can fully understand what's going on. Because when I've worked with organizations in the past, so the operational leaders who actually have to deliver the message, sometimes they haven't been involved in the discussions that have been happening at a senior level. So make sure that you ask the questions, make sure that you know, how was this rationale formed? Importantly, what other alternatives have been considered? Really, really get behind that. because that will help you to feel more confident about delivering the message. Get close to your HR business partner. I appreciate not everyone will have HR in the room, for example, or in the virtual room, but really get close to your HR business partner. Spend time with them. Again, understand the process, understand how redundancy actually works, because some managers, this will be their first time of having to deliver those messages, which, as you say, are incredibly difficult. So if you don't understand the broader context, it can make it difficult. And also, you might find yourself saying things that you shouldn't say. So really understand the legalities of it as well. So yeah, get close to your HR team. You're going to need to understand things like the timetable, the next steps, and what your role is in the process, because it will be different in different organizations. And then what I would do then, as you're kind of preparing yourself for the meeting, is you might have some sort of a script, you might have some bullet points, you're going to have some sort of structure that you're going to have to work with. Familiarize yourself with that, but also think about, and I think this is really important, is how do I want to show up as a leader in that meeting, and what does that person need from me? And kind of again talking to your HR colleagues around, well, understanding emotion, how do you handle emotion? I mean, we could talk about this for hours, but being prepared for what that might be. And no matter if someone is angry, if someone is tearful, if someone is in shock, just be prepared for it and be prepared to notice it. And then not necessarily have to solve it in the meeting, but just give them the time and the space if they need to cry or if they need to get angry, and just listen and just be there for somebody. And really importantly, in those meetings, no distractions, everything's turned off. You've got somewhere private to talk to somebody. And for that 20 minutes, half an hour, however long it is, that person in front of you is the most important person in your world for that next 20 minutes. Nothing else really matters. And if you can hold that space for somebody and make that connection, that is what they will remember, more so than the words, but they'll remember that at that time you were there for them as their manager. So there's loads of things I've said there. I don't even know how many there were, but babbled on.
We'll deep dive into a couple of the others, I think, because I think they're all important to note, aren't they? It is about making that space for people, but it is also making sure that you understand everything that goes on within that process. I know, obviously, within every company, redundancy is run differently, because it could be that you're making one person redundant, it could be that you're making thousands redundant. Um, but generally speaking, what's an overview of what happens in redundancy?
Um, Yeah, so it will depend on the numbers, but essentially there will be some kind of announcement. So that announcement will come from generally the most senior person in the organization. That's the leaders need to lead, and that will talk about the business concept, the business rationale, and what people can kind of expect. And then depending on if you're in collective consultation or if it's just going through individual, then there will be a series of meetings. Those meetings could involve employee representatives, they could involve trade unions. And then you'll move into individual meetings where, just as I've explained there, your line manager will sit with you and talk to you about, well, what does this mean for me? Is my role at risk or not? And therefore, if I am at risk, then what does that mean in terms of the process? So redundancies, they can vary in their length. What I would say is, if you are only making a small number of people redundant, then you would still need at least 2 weeks is reasonable. I mean, you could essentially make someone redundant within a week. You can have one meeting on the Monday, and you could have it was kind of a second meeting on the Friday if you really wanted to. I wouldn't recommend that. I would generally recommend 3 meetings and probably space those apart for at least over 2 weeks, because to your point earlier about, well, once I've been told my job's at risk, well, that's it, I'm gone. Well, technically, you need to have meaningful consultation. And meaningful consultation is an important part of the process. And that means you need an opportunity to respond, to put forward recommendations, to challenge. And to make other considerations. So, but essentially, that it's a process which will follow a structure. There isn't necessarily a sort of a fixed timeline, although there are timelines that you can't do redundancies more quickly, particularly if you're dealing with collective, you need to give people 90 days, etc. So it's there's some really good websites out there that have it all written down. I've got a really handy flowchart actually, if anybody wants to go on my website and have a look, with it all
Absolutely.
kind of written down. So I'm doing it here from memory. But yeah, it's a process. It is a two-way process. And I think people forget that. That's the point of collective consultation when you're dealing with larger numbers, in that there'll be an elected body that are there to ask questions and are there to propose things, to challenge things in a positive way. And I've managed redundancy programs where we'd planned X number of roles were going to be at risk. We put people at risk, and actually, as we worked through the detail, we realised that taking out two of these roles actually wasn't going to be practical. So we retained one person in the end, as a result of their kind of feedback to say, well, do you realise that if I'm not doing this, then this doesn't get done, and so's job, how will they cope with doing all of this extra, all that kind of thing. So it is important, if you're on the other end of it, that you do make those representations and make those challenges, because that's what it's all about.
Absolutely. I mean, my experience of it, so what was happening at the time was a rather large chunk of the company I was working for at the time was being let go. So we're talking hundreds of people. So we started with collective consultation. We were all made aware in, I think it was mid-June, somewhere around there, that roles would be at risk. And then in July, all the collective consultation happened and they managed to get round everybody. And obviously, it was made more difficult by the fact that we were a remote team anyway, never mind the fact that COVID was happening and nobody could meet up anywhere. So that made the process a little bit more difficult. But it was just a chance for us to really ask all the questions that we had to ask. And the company then responded to every last one of those. Like, we had several opportunities to ask questions because there were so many of us, and that every last one of them was answered in a publication after every meeting. So we got all the answers to that, and then we went into individual consultation, and I think some people just bowed out after session one. I went all the way to consultation four. so so like, as I said, I was on a crusade to keep my job. But it was just about like understanding why it was that my role was being made redundant. And that's an important point to remember as well, is that your role is being made redundant, not you. That's really important to remember. But just understanding sort of all the metrics that they're going against and all this sort of thing, and being able to challenge that and having that say. I mean, I don't regret a minute of redundancy happening to me, but it was good, I think, to see the full process. In some ways, I'm glad I pushed it that far, because actually then I got to see how this works, and like actually reflecting on it, how I could have potentially made the case a little better, but also where the rationale was on their side, to be able to
Mm.
say, okay, this is why your role's being let go. So so I think it is important to recognize that actually sometimes processes can be really long, and especially if you're an impatient person like me, that can be really difficult. So to have consultation last for effectively 2.5 months,
Yeah.
was a really, really difficult journey. But you do have to be patient with it. But I think, going back to what you said about giving people space to be able to ask questions and talk to people in between is so important, because it just helps to fill that gap a little bit, doesn't it? And just,
Mm.
I know it's not going to take 2 weeks, it's actually going to take 2 months, but in that time I've got this support and that support and this person, and you
Yeah,
know
and you know, I've worked with colleagues who are, their redundancy happens on like the Monday, the first meeting on the Monday, and essentially by the 2 weeks' time, that's it. They've left the organisation. And I've worked with other colleagues, as you say, who've been in consultation for a number of months, because maybe they are transitioning, maybe there is sort of kind of offshoring, for example, is quite common, where they want you need to stay because you're kind of training someone else up to do your job, which is difficult in its own way as well. Maybe there's some kind of retention bonus. We want people to stay, we want a certain number of people to stay till the end of we turn the lights out or whatever, if you're closing a business down. But during that time, you can start, if you feel the right headspace, to start thinking about what next. So a long consultation period can have its advantages and its disadvantages, and a short one, again, the disadvantages, you haven't got time to prepare, but the advantages, well, at least you know where you stand, and it's all over. And in large organizations, if they've got limited resources to have the meetings, you said there are hundreds of people. Well, it's always going to take a long time, because you can't physically get through that many people without bringing in some kind of external support. So yeah, the whole timing, I found out with my first one literally overnight, and that was it. There was no job and there was nothing to do. That was challenging. And the second one, there was a bit more involved in the process, but it wasn't too drawn out. But when I was in the thick of the process, I had no headspace to think about what I was going to do next anyway. So it's everyone approaches it slightly differently. But you said about some people bowed out kind of after meeting one. There's also the option of voluntary redundancy, which is always to be recommended as part of the process, because there will be some people who just say, actually, it suits me to go. And therefore, in fact, I'm working with an organisation at the moment. They've two people in a pool, and one of them saying to me, look, I just didn't want to stay. So I was able to save that other person going through the process. So, there's that to think about as well.
When we spoke about this episode, you talked a lot about being emotionally in control and the difference between empathy and sympathy. What's the distinction for you in that situation, and why is that important that leaders are aware of that?
Yeah, so and this isn't something that I was ever really aware of until I started to do my coach training all those years ago, back in 2016. And so leaders and people in general, this isn't, I'm not just being generalizing about leaders, but if you see someone in a distressing situation, so, you've just put someone at risk of redundancy and they're upset for whatever reason, the sort of default response might be to say, oh, don't worry, it's not that bad, or you'll find something soon. I'm sure everything will be okay. It could be the best thing that ever happened to you. None of those things aren't well-meaning. It's not like that individual doesn't want to help, but at that point in time, none of those things are really helpful to that individual who's literally overcome with emotion, is just kind of overwhelmed and not can't even begin to think about the future. So those are kind of sympathetic responses, which, if you think about it, if it doesn't have to be redundancy, if someone was to share something with you that was difficult and you said, oh, well, never mind, at least you don't have a terminal diagnosis. Everyone knows that that would be like the most extreme thing. And of course, losing a job isn't as extreme as that. But it almost shuts down the individual as if to say, oh, well, yeah, okay, yeah, maybe, yeah. Okay, I won't say anything else. So the sympathy makes the individual who is delivering it feel better. Oh, well, at least, you'll be fine. Or people used to say to me, you'll find another job quickly. And I used to think, oh, but what if I don't? And oh, well, okay, well, if I find a job quickly, I'll stop talking about it then. Whereas empathy is a more difficult choice. And Brené Brown has written loads about this, and she can describe it much better than me. But empathy is the choice to step into that emotion, if you like, to have that connection, to hold that space for somebody, and not to try and make them feel better, but to say something like, being put at risk of redundancy, that sounds like it's incredibly tough. What could I do to support you? Or what do you need from me? Or just literally, that sounds like it's incredibly tough. And then it leaves the individual, as a coach, it leaves the individual the opportunity to then talk, to think, oh, that person actually cares. And they've held some space, and that's an overused word, for me to then connect with them. So empathy is hard because you have to be prepared to sit with someone's emotion, and not everyone wants to do that, and not everyone can do that. But it's, Brené Brown calls it the brave choice, to be with someone in their darkness rather than rush to turn the light on so we feel better. So that's a quick whistle-stop tour of my interpretation of empathy versus sympathy.
Yeah, I think it's interesting actually. Brené Brown's been mentioned a few times on this podcast by, by
Well, there you
people.
go.
But Simon Sinek put it another way. He was like, prepared to sit in the mud with someone. Just sit and know that eventually they will get up and you can get up with them.
Mm.
It's this whole, want to not be uncomfortable ourselves, isn't it? We
Mm.
we automatically go to, well, that person's upset and that's making me uncomfortable, so I have to make myself feel comfortable by trying to make them feel better.
Yes.
And
Oh,
it's
yeah, definitely.
and we do it all the time with everybody in our lives, but like as you say, it's a conscious choice to change the way that you approach it and just accept that actually that person is feeling something and it's okay to just sit with them on that. You
Mm.
know.
And
Um,
and it is a conscious choice, and even and I think I'm relatively empathetic, because part of what I do is about having to develop that connection, and develop that connection quite quickly with somebody who you've never met before. And as a coach, you need to do that a lot. But it is conscious, because I think the unconscious choice, as you said there, is a sympathetic response. And I was shared this the other day with somebody. Somebody said to me that they were going to visit a friend who was really, really poorly. And I heard the words going around in my head for a few seconds of, oh, and I was going to say, oh well, and I was going to start with at least. Empathy never starts with at least, as in at least your friend's got some support and how lovely to have a friend like you, or something like that was going around in my head. I was like, no, no, hang on a minute. I have no idea what that person's going through. So instead, my response was, that sounds it like that's going to be incredibly hard for you and your friend. I hope it goes okay, or something like that. It was a while ago, but it was the conscious choice to not kind of push them away, as you say, with, oh well, at least your friend's got you, kind of thing, because I had no idea what was going on for them. And it's that it's hard to be empathetic because it takes a piece of you to connect with something in that individual. But I haven't heard the Simon Sinek quote about sitting in the mud. I've read a couple of his
Yeah.
books.
I think it's a really interesting analogy because there's been a few times where I myself have had emotions about something or other, and actually the people that I feel have most supported me are the people that just sit down next to me in the mud. And it's kind of like, yeah, they do. You just sit there and you don't care that you're dirty or that you're wet or cold or you know,
Yeah,
you
yeah.
just want to feel. It's kind of this, oh, I'm just gonna go for a walk in the rain for a while, and it's like it's not even raining. It's like, oh, I can't even catch a break, that kind of analogy. Um, you just want to sit in the mud. You want to be there. You want to feel stuff. And I think that's important for us to do sometimes is just let ourselves feel it. But if you're the person trying to support the person who's feeling it, it's okay to just sit down and
Mm.
get dirty and be cold and wet and know that it
Yeah,
won't be forever,
yeah.
just for a little while. But I think it's also important sometimes to recognize when we're not able to make that choice as well. I think there's been a couple of times where certainly with friends, where friends have been through a difficult time of some sort, and I've not been in that place to be able to sit in the mud with them. I don't have the energy because I'm sitting in the mud with somebody else or something else or
Mm.
whatever. So being able to just step away, because frankly, I'd rather not say anything if I can't do it right. That's my kind of thought process on that. Does that make sense? I know it's a little
Yeah,
bit more difficult when you're talking about
yeah.
leaders making people redundant, but because you have to be there. You have
Oh
to have the
yeah, yeah. You haven't got a
conversation. You've got
choice.
to have the meeting.
Yeah,
Yeah, you
yeah.
haven't got a choice. Um, but it's knowing when actually you can say to somebody, you know what, I think this person might be a really good support for you, and recommending somebody else if you can't sit in the mud with them,
Hmm.
like show them somebody who might be able to.
Yeah, and you'll know as a leader that you're never really going to know what's going on in people's lives, and everyone, and I know this from the years of coaching and in my own life, that everyone has got something else that they're dealing with. So redundancy will not be the only thing. They won't just waiting, going, oh, life's pretty much ticking along. I could do with something to challenge me. There'll already be challenges in their life, and as a leader, you'll be facing that as well. And so if somebody reacts in a certain way as a result of having a consultation meeting, or they share something with you, as you say, that maybe you don't feel confident to deal with or capable to deal with, maybe it's because you've got something else going on in your life that's pretty much similar, then knowing where to signpost people is really important, because as a leader, when you're managing redundancies, it is emotional for leaders as well, and to be able to put those boundaries in place and to be able to have the time and the space to manage their own emotion when they've still got to keep the wheels on the bus, they've still got to keep the lights on and keep everything moving, because it's just a small proportion of the team that are going. So it's recognizing that as well and making time and space for that. So in a if you're doing redundancy consultation meetings all day, do not put them back to back, because you just won't physically be able to do it. And also emotionally, it'll be too draining as well. So again, if you've been presented with a timetable that has you in consultation meetings from 8 till 6, well, you need to challenge that and say that I cannot do that, because that's just not going to give the individuals enough time, but it won't give me enough time to decompress and kind of process in between meetings as well. So.
Absolutely. If there's any time that you need to show up as the best leader you can be for that person, it's that moment,
Mm,
isn't it? So
yeah.
yeah, having that space and recognizing actually where perhaps a culture or natural habit within an organization is going to naturally dictate that, like preempting that if you can. If you
Hmm.
know that it's normal for just having back-to-back meetings all day, as soon as you get told that you're going to be having to do consultation meetings, make them aware of it and say, actually, yeah, I don't think we can do back-to-backs here. Like, Let's make sure
Mm.
we plan gaps and try and, yeah, preempt it rather than just letting it happen and then challenging it. If you can see a problem before it happens, then deal with it. Because the smoother you can make that process for everybody, the better, I suppose.
Yeah, and that might be that I mean, the other challenge is you want as many people to hear as quickly as possible, because obviously the grapevine will start. So if you've got 20 people in your 20 direct reports and you realize it's going to take 2 days to get through them, well, at best probably, then you might have to bring in some more support from your peers or maybe from the senior team so you can get through more people in a parallel process. So I think as a leader, it's not necessarily thinking that this process is being done to you, that you don't have a voice and you can't advocate, because ultimately you're advocating for yourself, but also for the individuals as well. Because the worst thing is if you've got those meetings and they're back to back to back, and then somebody needs a bit more time than someone else, and you're kind of looking at the clock and you're thinking, well, hang on a minute, we've got Bob coming in at 10 and it's already quarter past. It's a recipe for disaster. So yeah.
We mentioned about, obviously leaders having space for themselves, but like if they need support, like where can they get it? Where should they go as a starting point?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I would say is to have that relationship mentioned at the start, but have that relationship with their HR manager, business partner, whatever the job title is. That's not to say that the HR department are there to fix everything and to kind of, offload with everyone's problems, as it were. But if you've got that relationship at the start, if the two of you are working together in partnership, and you know that if you have had a challenging conversation, or maybe something's triggered something in you, or you're just exhausted by the whole thing, that because you've established at the start that we're working together on this, if you like, and that was always my approach. It was always in partnership. The manager would lead the meeting, but I would be there for support, and it was a process that we were going through together as as like as a partnership. Then you've got that, and depending on your relationship with your line manager in terms of the senior relationship, or just colleagues and people that you can talk to and just kind of offload to. Confidentiality is obviously to be maintained around individuals if you're talking to peers, as it were. But I think having those relationships and knowing who you can talk to, we talked before about people that can hold space for you and just listen. So that would be my first port of call. Obviously, some organisations have employee assistance programs, but I would suggest that you want to make sure that you're using the internal resources first, because if you're struggling as a line manager, then I would suggest that your HR manager will want to hear about that first, rather than necessarily relying on an EAP to get some support if it's directly related to the process in itself.
Definitely. And HR manager, business partner, whatever you want to call them, will ultimately help you take ownership of it and what you have to do. Because I mean, I've spoken about this in the past, like anything to do with HR. It's HR are there to advise you, to guide you, but it's you, the manager, that's still got to do that. And the sooner you accept that and own it and take ownership of it, the better off you are. So if you've got those kinds of relationships, as you say, it's just going to make you feel like, yeah, I can do this and I've got this and it's totally in my hands, but I know I've got support if I've got questions or if I need advice or if I'm overwhelmed or whatever it is. It's just having that person in your corner, isn't it? Not necessarily like in terms of what's happening with the redundancies, but just having someone in your corner to help you manage you so that you can lead other people.
Yeah, and I think in general, certainly when I was working in-house as a business partner, I would always want to have that relationship with my stakeholders. And so, depending on how your organization is structured, depending on how much contact you might have with the HR team, even if you've been in an organization for a number of years, if you're new, it's easier because it's part of your kind of 90-day plan, isn't it, to get to meet people. But even if you're listening to this and you've been in an organization for a number of years, you think, well, I don't really have that relationship with my HR manager, then I would encourage you just to reach out to them, because they are friendly people. They're people. That's why they're in HR. And just say, could we grab a virtual coffee sometime, or go and find them at the desk, depending on where you work. Because if you're managing people, then the chances are that you're going to need that relationship with the HR business partner. And so I would encourage you to do that, because the stronger that relationship is, the easier it can be for you to lead, because as you say, it's not the HR team's job to lead for you, but you'll have more of that guidance, you'll have more of that information, you'll just feel like you're not doing this alone, if you like, as a line manager.
So now to the big question.
Oh,
Why does having outplacement support matter so much?
oh, well. where do I start? So, if you've ever experienced redundancy, which you have, you will know how isolating it can be, how, when the decision's made and that's it, you're kind of on your own and you have that first day at home, it can feel deafening. I remember the silence was just deafening because everyone had gone off to do what they do. Children had gone to school, partner had gone to work, etc. And you can feel incredibly alone. And it's almost like you're sort of on the outside looking in on everyone else because everyone else is just carrying on. So isolation is a big thing, and having outplacement support, you have somebody who's working alongside you. One of the things that we say to clients is, I want you to know that you're not alone. So that's kind of from a that perspective. Also, if you've ever tried to write your own CV, it's a really hard thing to do. And if you've had your confidence knocked through a redundancy process, which lots of people will have, it's even harder. And if you've never had to write a CV or you've no idea where to start, then that can feel overwhelming. So, the practical side of having outplacement support is important for people, and it improves their chances of finding their next role quicker, finding a role that's going to suit them, and finding a role that they're kind of going to be happy in. And if as an organization you really care about people, if that's somewhere on your values, then you will offer outplacement support because it says to people, we care about what happens to you even in difficult circumstances. So we cared about you while you were employed, and we care about this situation, which is unavoidable because the business has taken a downturn or we've lost a contract, or whatever the reason might be for the redundancies. So outplacement support matters to organisations because it can help to protect their brand and their company reputation if you're thinking about it commercially. People talk about how they're treated, and people remember how they were treated when they left more so than their induction. I can guarantee that. I'm sure you can remember more about your redundancy process than you can about when you started. And so that's important because it can make it more difficult to hire people ultimately if word gets out that you're not an employer that cares about people. So the best talent will go somewhere else. And it can impact retention of those people who are in the organisation because if they see that you're not looking after their friends and colleagues that have had to leave, then they might think, well, I was thinking about leaving anyway, and now I've seen that process was just awful. And if that's the way they're going to treat me if they make redundancies in the future, do you know what? I think I might go anyway because I was already looking. So there's lots of kind of commercial reasons why it's important. But I think if you can put yourself in someone else's shoes, or if you ever know anyone who's experienced redundancy, and most people will have now. I mean, 20 years ago, when I experienced it for the first time, it was literally the culture of jobs for life, which made it even harder because I thought, well, hang on a minute, I've just been made redundant. This wasn't supposed to happen. But most people, redundancy will have touched their lives in some way. And so thinking about, well, if that was my sister or my brother or my friend or my colleague or me, what kind of experience would I want?
I think you're right. It's not just the commercial side of it, is it? It's making sure that people do leave on the best note possible. There's that old Maya Angelou quote, isn't there? People don't remember what you said or what you did, they remember how you made them feel.
Mm,
And that's just as true of an employer making you redundant as it is of a friend or a stranger in the street. So whatever you can do to just say, yeah, we from a business perspective, we are having to make this decision. However, we understand that there are human beings at the center of all of this, and this is what we're doing,
mm,
to make sure that you can leave on the best night possible. I think that speaks volumes, and you're right, it is much more common, especially due to recent events in the world, and with it couldn't be avoided.
mm.
From a business perspective, it just couldn't be avoided. It was going to happen.
Mm,
So, but I think, like so many other things in the last 5 years, it's been a very new experience for a lot of companies. So, sharing things about outplacement support, the fact that it exists for a start, and what else it involves, and that there are people out like you out there doing that, helping companies with this, might just help people to get a bit more of a solidified process in place. So although outplacement isn't a legal requirement, it's like, well, okay, that we can still do it.
mm,
Let's do it. Let's be proactive. Let's go above the legal requirements, like I hope most companies try to do with most things regarding HR.
mm.
Let's go beyond the legal requirements and let's make sure that our people do leave on the best note possible.
Yeah, no,
And
it is. You're absolutely right. And it's just part of that employee experience and the employee life cycle. It's about treating people with care and respect and dignity. And I think until you've experienced it, you can't fully appreciate what it means to one day have a job and the next day be told you might not have a job, or in some cases, in 2 weeks' time, you're probably not going to have a job. It can happen quite quickly, as we said before. And it's a life-changing event. And in other life-changing events, naturally, you would be offered some kind of support or counselling or whatever it might be for those list of things that can come up and we can face. So I feel like it's the right thing to do, and it also makes commercial business sense, as you say.
So you've mentioned a few things like throughout our conversation so far about the types of outplacement support that are available. So things like CVs, LinkedIn profiles, cover letters, interview coaching, all this kind of stuff. In terms of the not so practical support, what kind of things could businesses do for their employees?
So if they weren't able to offer outplacement support, for example, so because it is a cost, and often when you're making redundancies, you're reducing costs. So it might just be they physically don't have it. So there are things that employers can do before people leave. So if you've got a team, a talent team, for example, talent acquisition team, then you could lean on them and ask them to run some CV workshops, for example, because those guys will have seen lots of CVs and they can give some hints and tips, or like maybe some lunch and learns or something like that that you could do. As leaders, I think it's important to offer to have those conversations with individuals. If you'd want to have a chat with me, I'm happy to look at your CV or give you some tips for interviews or make some connections for you or help with your networking, or maybe organize even some kind of lunch and learn networking opportunities for people to, particularly in larger companies, to kind of exchange details and that kind of thing, or have introductions made for them within their network. So I think there's things that companies can do. Again, it depends on resources. It's harder to obviously do things after people have left because not everybody's going to find a role before they leave. So, and there are free services out there. So DWP, there's information there. The gov.uk website's got information on it. There's plenty of free stuff on there for people to use. So I think it's about saying, well, what can we do for people that's practical? If we're not going to offer outplacement support because we can't afford it, then that's absolutely fine. But try and put something together for people, even if it's just a pack of information. Give that to a graduate or something. If you've got someone or a trainee or whatever working in the department, right? Well, can you spend the next week pulling all this information together? That's what we're going to give to people, and just really helping people to leave in the best possible way, really, and pooling your internal resources about what you know to give people access to some information. Because in those early days, people might not be able to think about what they're going to do next, but at least if they've left with something or they've had access to some information, then that's going to be helpful.
The point that you brought up about networking is really powerful, like introductions that could be made, like encouraging them to reach out to other companies or to other people that are a friend of a friend, or
Mm,
things like that. Just spreading simple actions that they can take can just sometimes help people get out of that rut, I think,
hmm
and just be willing to try. I mean, it was about probably I think it was about a week before I put a message out on LinkedIn saying, yeah, I've been made redundant, like I could use some help. In that week, I was kind of like, okay, well, there's nothing I can do. There's nothing. All I can do is write a CV and hope that there's a job out there. And that was kind of the extent of my thinking. So it's just bringing that perspective back, I suppose, to people, isn't it? That actually there are simple things that they can do that cost them nothing, you
mm,
know. And yeah, utilizing the connections that you have as a management team, to help out people. If you don't have the right connections for somebody, but you know somebody who might, pass them along and let them explore that. Just pointing out those tiny little things can really motivate people to see, you know what I mean? Yes, it is going to be okay. There are things that I can do, and it's
mm.
okay for people to sit with things when they're ready to move on and they're ready to accept that they've got to look for another job. They've already got those little things that they can start doing for themselves. And that matters so much, I think, is when you feel completely useless and like there's nothing you can do, you know,
Yeah,
for
yeah.
someone to just give you those practical little tips for you to do at home.
And building that new routine and that new structure, because as I said before, it's all of a sudden the day is long. You have 6 hours, 8 hours, whatever it is in front of you. Or if you live alone, you've got the whole day before something might happen in terms of any of those other structures that might still be in place. And developing those new routines of, well, I'm going to make 4 connection requests on LinkedIn. I'm going to contact 2 agencies. I'm going to go for a 1 hour walk. I'm going to apply for 4 jobs. whatever it is, but helping to think about, well, what can those practical things look like? It doesn't mean to say you've got to go and post a video of yourself on LinkedIn on the first week, because that will be way out of most people's comfort zone. Even doing a post is way out of most people's comfort zones. But one of the things that I say to individuals, if we work with them before they're made redundant, is, well, ask your line manager or the HR team, well, who do you use to recruit people? Can I have a list of the agencies that you use? Or, as you say, could you make an introduction for me? What connections do you have? And one of the things that I find that people really undervalue is the importance of connections and that hidden job market that we often talk about. So not just taking a traditional approach to looking for work, but thinking about who can make introductions for me. It's not about giving people jobs. It's about saying, well, I wouldn't have heard about that had it not been for that introduction to that person, or just having those informational conversations about, I'm thinking about a career change. I'd love to know what it's like to be a project manager. Could we have half an hour? So and so's recommended I have a chat with you. You don't know where those things are going to lead. So there's so many things to think about, which comes back to that point of why is outplacement support important? It's because there's so many things that people just don't know and won't be very good at. And I don't mean that in a negative way, but why would you be good at looking for a job if you've had a job for 15 years? You don't need to be good at looking for a job because you haven't had to do that.
Yeah.
People won't say, yeah, one of my top skills is looking for a job. I'm really good at that. Because hopefully you don't have that many times to do it.
Can you imagine sitting
Um,
in an interview and saying
yeah,
that?
yeah. So, and that's why, on top of redundancy, because it's not just about career change, it's about everything else that goes with redundancy and the emotion of redundancy. That's why working with an outplacement specialist, I think, is really important.
If you had one key message for every leader who will be making someone redundant out there, what would that message be?
I would say, remember to show up as a human being, because that's what the individual will want from you in the Zoom meeting or when you're in the room. They want to connect with a human being. They want to know that you're showing up as you, and that showing up as you means that the person across from the table really matters. Excuse me. So yeah, don't feel that you have to show up as a robot or just someone there to read the script or deliver the words, but to show up as a human and to connect with the individual.
June, you support your clients to support their teams through incredibly difficult and challenging times. And having worked with you myself, I know you're extremely people-centered and always want to make the very best out of a situation that you can for everybody you work with. If there are organisations out there right now who are about to go through this and think they could use your help, where could they find you?
Yes, so you can find me on LinkedIn. I'm June Hogan on LinkedIn, or you can reach out to me on the website, which is wildwoodcoaching.co.uk.
Excellent. And I will put those links in the description for this episode as well. So if you want to find them, just go into the description and you can click June in there. So, June, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on today. When I started this podcast, I wanted to talk about the whole experience of leadership as far as I could. And that meant bringing the hard conversations to the table as well as the easy ones. So I think the key message I've taken from today was to remember that people are at the heart of all redundancies and that you have a massive responsibility as a leader to help them leave on that best note possible and with all your support until the very last moment as well. So you deal with what can be a very difficult experience for all involved, and the work you do is so important, especially in this very challenging climate we all find ourselves in at the moment. But I hope you've enjoyed being a guest today on the podcast.
I have. It's been a lovely conversation. It's been a very nice chat, and I hope that those people who are still listening have enjoyed it too.
I hope so too. It's an important conversation, but it's also been an insightful and empowering one. Thank you so much for coming along.
Oh, you're welcome, Laura. Thank you.
Until next time, everyone.